So as we saw before the break, the period following on from 2015-16 will be one of continuing austerity. Now, the settlement for the Department of Health is a particularly contentious issue, particularly because it makes up such a large share of public service spending, almost a third by 2013-14. On the one hand, there are real demand and cost pressures which may necessitate an increase in the Department of Health budget. However, increasing this budget will have serious implications for other departments, and we're going to look at what those implications are. So looking at UK health spending between 1949-50 and 2013-14, we adjust for economy-wide inflation over this period, and we see that it's increased in real terms significantly across this period of time. There's been an average annual real growth rate of 3.8%, so this has increased by 3.8% in each year. However, there is significant variation across different periods. So under the last Labour government, this increased at a real terms rate of 5.6% per year, following the conclusion of the Wanless Review and a pledge to meet Western European spending targets. The Conservative government before this increased spending at 3.4% per year, and a variety of governments at 3.7% per year as well. Looking at health spending in the UK as a percentage of national income, this has increased over time as well, from 3.5% in 1949-50 to 7.5% by 2013-14. Health spending has also increased very drastically as a proportion of total public and public service spending. So as we see from the 1980s, looking at the yellow line, as a share of total public spending, this has increased to around 18% by 2013-14. Taking away what we spend on social security and servicing the debt, we see that this has almost risen to a third of this spending, so 31.5% by 2013-14. And it's because of the size the role that health plays within our total spending that we really need to focus on what is happening to the Department of Health budget and what this will mean for other departments. So what we looked at before is total UK health spending. What we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation is health spending within England. And this is the responsibility of the Department of Health. Now, between 2010-11 and 2015-16, their budget is forecast to increase in real terms by 6.2%, or on average 1.2% per year. Now, this is very favourable compared to the overall cut seen in other departments of 15.3%, or an average annual cut of 3.3% over this period of time. However, it is noticeably below the increases they enjoyed in the period immediately preceding this. And there's a number of demand and cost pressures which we may think that require real budget increases in the future. So looking first at the demand pressures, some of these arrive from demographics, and there's two different channels through which demographics play an important role. So first of all, the size of the UK population is increasing. Forecast growth of 0.7% up to 2019-20 is expected, and health spending would have to rise in line to keep spending per head in line with this. Secondly, an increasing proportion of this population are made up of older individuals. So older individuals require more and more expensive healthcare on average, and therefore if you have a larger share of these people in your population, you need to spend more money on them. And this is demonstrated by the current age profile of English health spending. So on this figure, we can compare the spending that is conducted for an average person of a given age with the average spending for a 30-year-old. So looking first at the average 60-year-old, twice as much money is spent on the health service treating people who are age 60 compared to those who are age 30. This increases if you look at older ages. So looking at an 80-year-old, this ratio is around 4.5 times. So if you have more people in the far right of the graph, where you have older individuals, you would expect the cost of providing healthcare to go up. So to keep pace both with the population growth and the changing age structure, we'd need a real increase of 1.2% per year. Now, this is under quite a strong assumption that this age profile remains unchanged. Now, over time, this is likely to change as we can treat different conditions and as people become healthier as they live longer. A second demand pressure arises from the increased prevalence of chronic conditions. So if we look at over the last 20 years, conditions such as diabetes have been increasing quite drastically. So the Nuffield Trust estimate these increased demand pressures by 2%. So this is actually a larger impact than the demographic pressures we saw before. Additionally, there are changes in available treatments. As new drugs come online, we can treat conditions that we couldn't do before, and therefore there'll be extra demands on the health service. So we've seen the demand pressures, now we can look at the cost pressures. And these pressures tend to increase the real cost of healthcare over time. These arise from two sources. The first of which comes from non-labour goods and services, so this is buying the equipment you might use in a hospital. And these have been roughly increasing in line with the economy-wide inflation when we look over a historical period. The second channel are from staffing costs. Now, historically, these have been increasing at a much quicker rate than economy-wide inflation. So if you look between 1985 and 2010, pay within the NHS actually increased at twice the rate of the GDP deflator. However, it is important to realise that not all labour costs represent genuine cost pressures. So if people become more productive over time and you're paying them in accordance with this, then it doesn't really increase the cost of providing these services. What is a genuine cost pressure is the increase in wages that are driven by the need to keep pace with economy-wide wage growth. So if other sectors are paying people more, the NHS may have to increase the pay for their staff to keep those jobs competitive and to keep people in those jobs. Now, distinguishing between these types of costs can be very difficult, and therefore estimating these pressures is quite a hard job. So we have our demand pressures and we have our cost pressures. What do we think the impact of these are? The combined effect of demand and cost pressures is estimated by NHS England to be around 3.5% per year. Now, this equates to £30 billion funding gap by 2021. So this figure has been much debated in the media recently, and essentially, controlling for inflation, in 2021, this suggests we need £30 billion on top of the 2013-14 budget to meet these demand and cost pressures. Now, of course, this funding gap could be reduced by productivity improvements. So if you can produce the same level of healthcare with fewer inputs, this would represent a rise in productivity. So NHS England, in their 5-year forward view, have set out 4 different productivity scenarios that they think are achievable, and we're going to say what this implies for spending for the NHS England budget, and then we can look at what this means for other departments. So if we take the first scenario of 0 productivity growth over the next 5 years, so 0% per year, you would have to fund the entire pressure that we saw before from a real increase in the NHS England budget if you wanted to meet this demand gap. So once we convert this to 2015-16 prices, this is 27 billion. So just to be clear, this is the same figure that we saw above as 30 billion, but in slightly different prices. Now, obviously, if you have greater productivity gains, you need a smaller real increase to meet this gap. So a 0.8% per year productivity improvement, which is about in line with historic productivity gains in the NHS, would require an increase of £19 billion in the NHS England budget in real terms to meet this gap. Now, in recent years, productivity is estimated to be more like 1.5% per year, and this would require £15 billion in additional funding. In the most optimistic scenario of 2.4% per year, around £7 billion would be needed to fill this gap. Now, in 2021 prices, this is £8 billion, which has also been much debated in the media, and it seems that implicitly most parties have signed up to providing this. This is also the preferred combination of productivity gains and real increases, which Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England, has suggested is feasible to be delivered. Now, it's also worth noting that, of course, you could choose not to meet these demand pressures, so not to fill this entire gap. Obviously, this is a very difficult decision, and with the political interest around it, it would be hard for a government to do this. However, it is an option. So, as we've seen, there are pressures which suggest that NHS England require more money. But this would mean that to meet given total spending cuts or total spending amounts, you would have to cut money elsewhere. So, as of Autumn Statement 2014, departmental spending cuts of a total 3.7 per year are penciled in. So, the larger increases you see in the Department of Health budget, for which NHS England are funded, the larger cuts you would require. So on this figure here, we can trade off the average annual increases in the Department of Health budget with spending cuts to other departments. So as you move further along the x-axis to the right, you're seeing larger increases year on year for the Department of Health, and as you move down the y-axis, you're seeing larger cuts. So if we take our different scenarios that we just saw before, starting with our 0% productivity gain, this would require a budget increase in real terms of 3.9% in each year for the Department of Health. And this would require 8.0% cuts in total departmental spending for other departments in each year. So this is quite a large trade-off. Taking our most optimistic scenario of NHS productivity of 2.4% per year, this would require a 0.8% improvement in the Department of Health each year and would cut other departmental spending by 6.1%. If you took your scenario somewhere in the middle, you would have a smaller trade-off than our worst-case scenario, but a larger trade-off than we saw before. Now, as has been pointed out in the past presentations, the total spending cuts penciled in by Autumn Statement 2014 look quite different than what we would expect under any government that would come in the future. So the three main political parties have set out different fiscal rules which would allow a higher level of spending in total. So now we can say, what do those scenarios mean under those different fiscal rules? So if we bring up what we saw before, with the white line showing the current coalition plans as of Autumn Statement 2014, and our 0.8% increase in the Department of Health budget, this would require 6.1% cut in other departmental spending in each year. Now, under the Conservative fiscal rule, which is the tightest, this would require a 3% cut in other departmental spending if we increase Department of Health spending by 0.8% each year. The Liberal Democrats have the next tightest rule, and this would require a 1.2% cut in other spending, and under a Labour government, this would be 0.9%. So, although the trade-offs are smaller, the thing to take away from this really is that if you increase the Department of Health funding, you're still going to have to cut other departments by a larger amount. So in summary, the Department of Health budget has planned to increase by 1.2% per year between 2010-11 and 2015-16. This has been more favourable than departmental spending cuts seen elsewhere, but is below the long-run UK average health spending growth that we saw in the preceding period. The NHS faces a variety of budget pressures from rising demand and costs, and NHS England estimate that these pressures amount to around 3.5% per year. It should be noted that other departments also face similar pressures, and we've highlighted the fact that the Department of Health takes up such a large share of total government spending to realise why this is so important. Departmental spending cuts will continue into the next Parliament, and increasing the NHS budget would imply even greater cuts for other departments. So under the Autumn Statement 2014 plans, a 0.8% increase for the Department of Health each year would imply a cut of 6.1% each year for other departments. As a result, the next government will have difficult choices to make, particularly when trading off health spending and other departmental expenditure. Thank you.